with that, I am going to now invite my wonderful panel, Mette Wilkie, who is the director of the Forestry Division for FAO. She was here for the COP, and now she's gone back home. Here is Jen Mueller, and she is the VP for Corporate Sustainability for MasterCard, and Rebecca Braswell with the Land Life Company. What I'd like each of you three to do is introduce yourselves, maybe no more than 2 or 3 minutes, and give your perspective for your role relative to what our panel's about in terms of the barriers we're facing and the investment opportunities. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a few questions we've talked about a few questions that I want them to answer. And then we're going to have a conversation, and we would like to invite you all, depending on how much you want to interact with us. So with that, we want to bring Mette to the room, and so I'm going to ask you to go first, if that's all right with you.
That's fine. Thank you very much for this, and I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you. I traveled back the day before yesterday. My name is Mette Wilkie. I'm a Danish forester, so I have a background in forestry. And 35 years ago, I traveled to Sierra Leone, West Africa, where I took up a job with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, to help with a forestry project there. And one of the things I did there was help with the first restoration of degraded mangrove areas in West Africa. I then spent the next 9 or so years primarily in Asia, in Bangladesh and the Philippines, with half a year in Italy and I think a year in Scotland, doing short-term consultancies, having 2 kids, and taking a second master's degree, this time in environmental management. I then joined FAO at the headquarters in Rome in dealing with forest management for a number of years, moved on to take on the role of the lead of the Global Forest Resources Assessment, something that we do every 5 years. Became deputy director, left FAO in 2014 to move to the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, in Nairobi for 4 years as the director of their ecosystems division, dealing with all types of ecosystems and the management and restoration of those. Moved back to Rome in 2018. I'm now leading the work on forest of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. As such, I'm also wearing 2 other hats. One is chair of what's called the Collaborative Partnership on Forest, which are 15 global organizations that have a mandate on forests. So we have most of the UN, the Rio Conventions, we have academia, we have IUCN, we have the Global Environment Facility, etc. So we try to pull together and coordinate our actions. The second hat I'm wearing, and that's the second logo up on my background here, if you can see that as well, is I'm one of the co-leads of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. This is something that was initiated from 2021 to 2030, and FAO and UNEP are co-leading the implementation of that decade. So that's basically why I'm here and engaging in the discussion here with you today. So thanks a lot for inviting me.
And Mette, one of the things I asked all 3 of you to do is tell us where you grew up and where you are right now. I just want to place us with you guys. Oh, by the way, if I were to do this for myself, I was born and grew up in Tanzania, and I live in Austin, Texas. So if you can do that for...
All right, certainly. I was born and grew up in Denmark, but haven't lived there for the last 35 years. Went out for 2 years, never came back. Where I'm calling home at the moment is an old farmhouse in a forested valley in Umbria in Italy, and that's where I'm sitting right now.
See, did you hear the reaction, guys?
Everyone's very jealous.
So, how about you? To you, Jen?
That's a tough act to follow. Hello, everybody. My name is Jen Mueller. I'm Vice President of Corporate Sustainability at MasterCard. And I've been at MasterCard for 12 years, spending the majority of that time actually in our product development and product management organization. and only recently joined our sustainability team, actually in the height of the pandemic. It was May of last year. Before I forget, I'm a New Yorker by birth, a New Yorker by current address, but when I come to places like Glasgow, I think about how nice it would be to have lived somewhere else. My husband is Italian, so Meta, we are scheming about how to spend the summer next year working and living from Italy. So maybe I'll talk to you about the farmhouse.
Come visit.
If it's rentable, we should talk later. So just a little bit of background on my role at MasterCard. So we are a technology company. I often start these discussions by talking about what we are, but also what we're not. So we are immediately assumed to be a financial services company, which we are, but we are more than that, a financial services technology company. We're not a bank. We're not a regulated financial institution. We are the rails on which transactions flow between merchants and consumers and banks. As a result, our footprint is relatively small. We don't manufacture goods. You know, the majority of our emissions come from our data centers and the technology outlets that we have to power our network. So when we set out on our journey from an ESG standpoint and setting that strategy, we said, of course, we want to do the right thing. We were the first in the payments industry to have an approved science-based target. We declared a commitment to net zero earlier this year by 2050 and have been consistently meeting the emissions reductions in scope 1, 2, and 3 for the last 4 years, from our 5 years from our 2016 baseline. So we accelerated our net zero commitment from 2050 to 2040. We just announced that at the beginning of COP. So those are all table stakes, right? As a brand, a global brand, a brand that hopefully many of you are carrying around in your wallets, we feel we have not just an opportunity, but an obligation to stand for both in our interactions with customers and also in the work that we do each and every day. You know, our job is to create a digital economy that is inclusive and equitable for everyone, everywhere. And that means people, that means planet. So we've gone beyond living in our box and thinking about what our own strategy should be, and using that global network of 20,000 banks and 80 million merchants and 3 billion cardholders to try to activate action. So we made a commitment to plant 100 million trees in the next 5 years. That's the right trees in the right places. We've engaged experts to help us on this journey because, as I said, I used to be a product management guy and now I'm in sustainability. So we need people to advise us, real scientists with real experience and real credibility. So we partnered with Conservation International and World Resources Institute as our implementation partners for that goal. And every day that goes by, I think about how they are guiding us down this journey that has become commonplace in the private sector, which is the proactive investment in nature. And maybe one observation, this is my first COP. I've never been to a COP before. And I'm so excited to hear about not just the commitments that Mark Carney is talking about and the 30 by 30 and the deforestation commitments. Oh, obviously those are all very, very exciting. I'm also really excited about my private sector counterparts who are stepping up to those same kind of commitments, making really bold commitments and being transparent about how they're going to follow through. But this to me feels like it's obvious, right? Proactive investment in nature should be a priority for anyone and everyone. It's for businesses, it's for governments, it's for civil society. We can't do it alone. We all have to work together. It seemed obvious to me, especially as a former product person. You build a program, you set the key performance indicators. How do you measure success? To me, measuring success on climate action has to have a nature component. We can't get there without the nature component. So that seems obvious to me. And the fact that it is obvious here at COP, and it sounds like it wasn't obvious at prior COPs.
It wasn't. Yes. Would you all agree?
It sounds crazy to me. Now, I'm naive, I suppose. Like I said, this is my first COP. But I think that it is a good sign, and it's not just blah, 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 that we're all here, civil society, governments, private sector, joining hands in hopefully what will translate from incredibly bold commitments to really incredible follow-through, and ultimately translating all of those commitments and those dollars into trees in the ground.
Yes, great. Well, how about you, Rebecca?
Greetings, my name is Rebecca Braswell. I am the CCO and founding member of Land Life Company. I grew up in Washington, D.C., but I come from a farming family in the Midwest in southern Illinois, where we've been farming the same area. There's a bit of an echo.
It's your hair.
Is it my hair?
I know.
From a farming family in the Midwest, where we've been farming the same piece of land since the 1840s. And so while I grew up in a city, that concept of balance, long-term, responsible natural resource management, mixed use of our land has just been a core part of who I am and what I've brought to my jobs. And now live in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, where I was the founding member of Land Life Company. And our mission is to help restore the world's 2 billion hectares of degraded land. So we focus on planting trees. We are going to be planting 4 million trees this planting season. And these are on degraded landscapes, so where nature will not come back unaided. Some form of intervention is going to be required. And my specific role in the company is to figure out what are the business models, what are the products and services that we can bring to the market to support investment in nature restoration. How do we define that? How do we make trees and nature be a product for a company like MasterCard or for corporations everywhere? So that we can facilitate that connection that has been broken, that needs to be rebuilt, so that we can restore what's been lost.
Thank you. So I'm going to keep doing a time check. So we'll go to shorter responses, but this panel was curated before the forest declaration. None of us knew about it really, unless we were insiders, I imagine. And the declaration sent a very powerful signal, right? And so what I wanted to ask each of you, in what one important way can you think of that this declaration changes the trajectory of the work you're doing, whether it already has in how you've noticed in the last week, or you see it? And just to sort of reset the stage, as it were. Shall we start with you?
Sure, I'll go first. I already talked about proactive investment in nature. I think two things that I would say are going to be increasingly important, I think, for MasterCard and our work going forward and other private sector companies. And I think there was a gentleman from Capital for Climate who mentioned this earlier today. There's a mindset change, but there's a tool set change that we need to be employing. And a lot of that is in redefining what is value, redefining what does a return on investment mean. And that for many in whether you're an accountant or you work in a small business or a big global company, that is in many cases been very cut and dry. You make more money than you spend. You make more money than you originally invested. That's return. The return on investment in nature is going to look and feel very different for every company. But I think that there is that mindset shift that will be expanding for many in the private sector and possibly in governments and civil society as well, in terms of how do you set the criteria for what is value and what is return. And I think that the second thing is there's been a lot of talk this year especially about the difference between sustainable business and regenerative business. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when regenerative was not part of our common parlance. And now I think it is becoming almost dated to say we are a sustainably minded business. That has shifted completely. When people ask us, why are we investing in trees? It's because we don't want to just operate sustainably. We want to build back better. Sorry, I'm American. So there's I think going to be an increasing investment, proactive investment in nature as more and more companies embrace that regenerative piece of criteria in defining what is value and what is an adequate return on investment.
So Meta, how would you respond? And really, you could also add, because you've left the COP, so you're outside, you've left this bubble that is COP, right? I mean, it really is a bubble, right? How many of you go home and nobody knows? I mean, you describe it, and for anybody, any of us that are COP veterans, it's like another world, right? You've gone back. How are people responding? And what has changed for you now that you're home?
Thank you. Let me just first and foremost say, and we've heard this throughout the week, this COP26 is really a nature and forest COP. There has been so much at the center of the discussions here. We've had discussions on forests before. Don't forget, we have even in Article 5 in the Paris Agreement on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. This time around, we wanted to complete also the discussions on the agriculture, the coronivia. Haven't quite gotten there yet. But certainly we had some announcements here with the declaration that was really interesting. We have already in the Sustainable Development Goals a commitment to halt deforestation, but we had more players around the table this time around. And there were two things I thought in the declaration that were at least, if not entirely new, but there was an added focus on that. One of that was the focus on Indigenous people and local communities, to really recognize their rights and their role as stewards of the forest resources and things. And I think that was really powerful. And the fact that there is an allocation of at least $1.7 billion for Indigenous people and local communities was a major achievement at this COP and something new. The other thing that I took note of was that in part of these sort of 5 or 6 areas that they are working on, there is a call to implement and, if necessary, redesign agricultural policies and programs to incentivize sustainable agriculture, promote food security, and benefit the environment. Now, this is new. And I think having that in the declaration from COP is very important. For us who deal with both forestry, agriculture, and fisheries in FAO, and particularly in forestry, where our main focus is to protect, manage, and restore the forests and support countries in doing so, I think it's just an added impetus to what we do, rather than a shift in a trajectory, if you will. But certainly there has been, as we've seen, more pledges, more different players coming to the table. And we really see that that is something that we can build on also within that UN decade on ecosystem restoration. We've now got sort of the starting platform to really scale up on that. And we all know why that is needed. We know that about 30% of the agricultural land is degraded, 30% of the commercial fish stocks are overexploited, and we're losing 10 million hectares of forest every year. So we can't do this. We can't deal with the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the economic crisis either, unless we take that into account. So that has been very positive, and I think will just speed up the work that we're doing and have more players around the table, which is really useful.
So very quickly, Meta is also in charge of the, I think I can say in charge of the decade for ecosystem restoration, which during the General Assembly in March 2019, the UN had that resolution passed. So I was going to ask you later how that fits into this, but she's already talked about that. 2 quick things, responses I had. So for me as Rainforest Partnership, one of our goals has been net zero deforestation by 2030. And our delegation here was the youngest I've ever brought. They've gone back because they had to go back to university. But my youngest delegate is 20, turned 22 weeks ago. Gen Z for the trees, not about protesting, not about petitioning, but actually holding people accountable, looking at all the various commodities. Front and center, their goal, net zero deforestation, their tagline, we're Gen Z, deforestation ends with us. They get here and the governments have caught up with them finally, right? If I had said this to any of you 5 years ago, you'd have looked at me like, who is this hippie, dippy, whatever, right? And now this is what we've adopted. And so what Meta's saying and what you're saying, it's sort of changed the framework. And the other thing is indigenous and local communities, that's in the language we use in all the work we do. People, I don't think, understood what that meant, and there it is in that declaration. It's a game changer, I think. So how do you respond, Rebecca?
No, I think very encouraged by what's been announced this week. I think it's still a step to go in terms of talking about ecosystem restoration, because I'm concerned if we just focus on trees, if we just focus on carbon, we're going to design the wrong solutions. Because the reason why it is so important to stop deforestation is it takes so long to rebuild nature. You know, sometimes I walk through our projects in northern Spain and I see these oaks that we've planted, and you know, despite many odds, they're thriving, they're growing, but they're still this big.
Yeah.
And to create a robust ecosystem again is going to take 20, 40 years. So fantastic that we're going to stop cutting down trees, because I don't think anyone really understands how difficult it is to rebuild the intricacy of nature. But second, in that design, how we rebuild it, that is the real question, because you could go out and plant a gazillion trees that are going to suck up water, be monocultures, you know, open to disease. We really need to think about diversity. We need to think about how we are incorporating connecting migration corridors, biodiversity. The design of nature goes so much beyond just trees or just carbon that we need to make sure that that is holistic. So I would love to come to COP next year and have the announcement be about ecosystems instead of just forests, because that is what it's going to take to realize our climate goals.
Right. Yes. And in fact, I wanted to ask you a couple of you this. So for carbon emissions and for people to set net zero targets or even reduced emission targets, it's a lot easier because it's the 1.5 degrees centigrade ambition. You can measure that a lot easier. But for biodiversity, you know, we've got the framework we're trying to create for 30 by 30. But how do you do that? It's a little bit like what you're talking about at the ecosystem level. But, you know, how do you design that so that it is something that's tangible for people to work with, right?
Yeah, no, so
back to you.
I think we have to stop doing these things in isolation,
Yes.
right? So climate, biodiversity, they are just incredibly linked. And I think that making it visible and tangible, you know, through the video you even showed, you can feel biodiversity, you can feel forests, you can feel ecosystems, and we need to have people connect to that. And that's what brings it all home together, because we will not be able to measure everything that we've destroyed. We will not be able to measure everything we need to build, and we need to accept that and be patient about that and trust what science has told us, but that data is going to take 20 years potentially to collect. So we need to trust the science. We need to bring these elements together. Otherwise, we're just going to keep going down the periodic table. I mean, I think about electric cars, and that's great. They're not emitting CO2, but let's talk about lithium. Let's talk about cobalt. We cannot treat these things in isolation. So the only way to really recognize them is to trust science and to bring these elements together in packages that people can understand and relate to, which is tangible, which is nature.
So couple of things. Before we end, I want to talk about the importance of in-person gathering. And, you know, with Kunming having been delayed, and, you know, when you do something virtually, even if it's procedural, I mean, we're working again, you know, across cultures, languages, ways of being and thinking. And this COP and also the IUCN Congress, we saw what came out of it. So I want to talk about that. But before that, I want to also give you guys a choice. Do we want to have a conversation and you ask each other a question that you want answered by one of us? Or should we open it up in the next about 15 minutes? So I want to do this in response to what happened in the earlier panel as well, because it's not just about a conversation with the four of us here. You've all been sitting there and listening. You know, what would you like? So I will first ask my three panelists if there is a burning question they have of one of the others. and then perhaps invite the folks. But I would like somebody to answer about your thoughts about being in person.
Maybe I'll start. I think that in the lead up to COP, there was a lot of discussion about whether it would really be the inclusive event that it needed to be. And I think that there are many represented here who may not have been represented in prior COPs, but it's not everyone. And that's something that we should keep in mind for future convenings, whether it's COP or in the plans that you're making yourselves. So Rebecca, when you're talking about like the work that private sector or others are doing in forest restoration or preservation, that has to absolutely be not just for climate goals, right? That has to be for biodiversity goals and for community. There's no way that those are going to be successful interventions if there isn't long-term stewardship that is being invested by these local communities. They need to derive benefit. It has to be as much for them as it is for climate, for biodiversity. So that those voices, I think, the more that we can do to make sure that those voices are represented, not just in meetings and rooms like these, but in the broader conversation. I was encouraged that there was such a good representation, despite the challenges of Indigenous peoples at the COP26 Blue Zone, where I had the privilege of being for a few days last week and in this week, and the richness of the dialogue that is brought to life because they are there and part of the conversation. And frankly, just the visibility that they provide, which is so sorely needed. If you're not there in person with these people, it's hard to really appreciate their plight, their voice, their motivations. Hearing it from 20-year-old women who are at the forefront of not just activism but actual action in Brazil, it's really extraordinary. And I would never have had that opportunity to meet these women had I not been here in Glasgow. So I think that's that community piece, and especially that of the communities that are in these areas where we know we need to make investments in climate, community, biodiversity, they have to be part of the conversation.
Meta, I want to make sure we don't leave you out because you're part of our conversation here. Did you have a question you wanted to ask one of the two here? Or would you rather have somebody from the audience come over? And we should say two people, and so that we don't create unnecessary expectations. And in the meantime, if nobody has questions, I know there were other things that we wanted to continue talking about.
I think there's...
Ooh, we have two.
Happy to go to the floor, absolutely.
Great.
Tell us who you are and your association as well, so that everybody has context.
Okay, I wanted to make a comment on technology in the last couple of sessions, but I'm Erica Dulu. I work at Nature Metrics. We're leaders in the provision of environmental DNA services and solutions. For anyone that's not familiar with environmental DNA, it's a relatively new technology, a new frontier, if you will, in biodiversity assessment. So you can now generate huge amounts of biodiversity data just by analysing the organismal DNA present in the environment, so such as soil, water, and others. So, for example, you can take a sample of soil and look at the whole soil biome just from that sample, look at the microbial communities, likewise with water. So, yeah, this is a really exciting technology to be able to inform on measuring biodiversity metrics. And I just wanted to highlight its potential for robust metrics on soil health, ecosystem health, which is underlying all we say today. And if anyone would like to hear any more about it, I'd be happy to chat
Thank you for sharing. I'm going to bring it back to the panel and back to you, Rebecca, just for a question. And that is, you talked about, there's a lot of money that's getting pledged.
Yep.
Pledges are easy right? For forests, we had the forest declaration in 2014. We wanted to get, half deforestation by 2020. We've had others. I'm not going to name them.
Yep.
But, it's always the details and how something gets deployed is the question. There have been solutions that were great for the 90s and the knots. But we're in 2021 in a very different reality. Do we need a paradigm shift? What do you think? What are the barriers now and what are the opportunities? And then we'll come back to one of you.
No, I think that's a really good question. I think there is more funding available than ever has been. But are the traditional pathways to deploying that capital going to empower the communities that Jen was just talking about? Because they need to be the long-term stewards of the land. And that process, I can't even begin to describe how much time it takes and how difficult it is, but how ultimately rewarding. For example, we're planting 4 million trees on 4,000 hectares. We don't own a single piece of land that those trees are going on, which means that we needed to communicate with the communities and the landowners across 4,000 hectares in a couple of different geographies to convince them of the benefits of planting trees, to talk about how we would deploy that capital. It is a door-by-door process, a town council meeting by town council meeting process. And I think we have a tendency with these big pledges to kind of skip over that how, to skip over the involvement that's going to be required to make sure that these projects are permanent, that people see the value of the tree. Otherwise, we're going to invest in a bunch of trees that will just be cut down for building, for firewood, for incomes for families that need it. I mean, if you asked me if I had to choose between cutting down a tree and feeding my 2 daughters, I would cut down the tree, and I plant trees for a living. So we have to address those problems, and I think you can't just fund forests without addressing broader issues of environmental justice and inequality.
Well, that's actually really, thank you for bringing it back. It's so interesting. In the last couple of months, there were at least 2 times when I talked about the indigenous, deep Amazon indigenous communities we work with. And during this pandemic, it's been very difficult. 2 of them, the indigenous peoples, their languages were just recognized 3 years ago. So that's how little we know them, right? And I talked to somebody about that, our projects, and they said, are you about indigenous people or are you about forests and the planet? And for me, there is no separation. And I think the world is finally catching up to that. But the reality always, again, is that it's not so simple to get the money down there. You have to earn trust. You have to work a different way. You have to understand, right? And so how about you, Meta? Before we go to somebody waiting to ask a question. Any thoughts on this?
Well, in terms of the finance, it's not just about getting new money in and on the ground. It's also about changing the subsidies that we have at the moment. We just had a recent report coming out by FAO, UN Development Program, and UN Environment Program that looked at support to agricultural producers. And every year there is globally some $540 billion going to agricultural producers. And they found that 87% of that, or about $470 billion, include measures that are often inefficient, inequitable, they distort the food prices, they harm people's health, or they degrade the environment. So we have a multi-billion-dollar opportunity here by repurposing agricultural support to transform food systems, to make them more sustainable, and at the same time hold that degradation that we have of the ecosystems and help starting to restore them instead. We all know that by restoring those, we are also enhancing the natural resources that are used both locally and globally. So we cannot achieve our sustainable development goals if we don't take ecosystem restoration seriously. So that's a key point to get across. And I think we are hearing it more and more. I've been very pleased with the way that has been taken up also at this COP.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I can't see you, but...
We had a multi-generational question, I think.
Okay, great. I know I can't see you because the lights are flooding our eyes.
5 minutes.
Okay, good.
Okay, so my name is Rachel Ashbofe Keme. I run a conservation organization in Nigeria called Southwest Niger Delta Forest Project. So before I go to my question, I'll just share a bit of background of what we're doing. So our organization is a small local NGO, and luckily and by the grace of God, presently we are managing, and we established and are managing 2 protected areas. And as many of you know in this room, Nigeria is Africa's most populous country, and not just that, could be the 3rd most populous country according to the UN estimates in a couple of years from now. So the challenges are real, and we are in the forefront of just trying to protect forests we're right in the heart of where there is very high human population density. And so we are doing that, and luckily we've been able to get established 2 protected areas, one in the Niger Delta and the other in the southwestern parts of Nigeria. We established those protected areas, and we are managing that. And the one in the Niger Delta is a community-based conservation area, while the one in the southwest is a collaboration between our NGO and the state government. And now here comes my question. As a small NGO, it's only about 8 years old, and we started getting some of these results in the last year or 2 years ago. And we are doing so much that's even beyond, it's a multidisciplinary team here, but this is us coming from, we built everything from ground up. We are restoring forests, we are restoring degraded, most of these areas are already degraded. We started off targeting specific species, and now we are protecting assemblage of species in these forest areas. And then we are doing, from managing these areas, we have gone to engaging communities to the level of doing alternative livelihood and supporting them, doing tree planting, teaching farmers how to
Will you, so sorry to interrupt, because
Okay.
Peter's going to cut us off.
I know.
Will you ask the question so that I manage to get your answer
to it
before he
immediately.
has to?
I just need to tie all this up together.
Of course.
Okay, so we're training farmers on agroforestry and all of that around the area. Now my question is that we are doing all of this not because we can do it or not because we are able to do it, but we are doing it because we have to. And now with the limited resources we have in our disposal. But when you come to meetings like this, COP or international meetings like this, and you hear declarations and targets, it's strange to the rest of us. Because as local grassroots organizations, I feel we have the solutions and we are making the solutions happen at the grassroots. I mean, you can say lots of things at the governmental level, but so much of that solutions is on ground. And the connection is really not there from up down to us, you know?
So,
So
totally
there are
agree
so
with
many
you.
collaborative partnership. When you have collaborative partnership, you don't hear of the UN working with local organizations, you hear them working with governments. And you don't hear governments working with local organizations, you hear them working. I may be wrong, but this is my own reality and how we are able to make things work.
So I don't think it's just your reality.
So my question is there a challenge with, say, for example, MasterCard working with a local organization? Is there a challenge there identifying those people? Because really there is really a cutoff, and there is really so much we can do. And if that could be somehow.
Yeah,
We can do it in about
I'll
a
go
minute.
really quickly. I think that the work that we're doing with Conservation International and WRI is not just with those 2 organizations. They are working with on-the-ground organizations like that of the speaker that was just describing. For instance, we have a restoration project that we're doing in Kenya. It is being implemented by a local organization called Greenbelt Movement, who has been working in the restoration of those landscapes in Kenya and the Makueni County area in that river valley for decades. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and they have the emotional and physical investment in restoring those landscapes. So we're working with large global NGOs who have really deep-rooted partnerships with these smaller organizations who, as our speaker was talking about, they know how to get shit done. We want to funnel funds toward those organizations, right? So I think part of the challenge is when you're working with large company like us, identifying organizations like what was just described. So I'm hoping that given that there are things like the Bezos Earth Fund and the 130 trillion that Mark Carney was talking about last week, the challenge is getting all of those dollars funneled into the actual on-the-ground efforts, and not just with the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International, but small organizations like that. So we're going to be looking to our civil society partners more and more to help make those connections and to really be deep-rooted, no pun intended, in these local communities so that they can identify these opportunities for us to invest in.
Thank you for that answer, because that is what's necessary, and that's the reason we are creating the collective, Rainforest Collective, because how do you map not just projects, but resources, expertise across regions, across sectors within the rainforest conservation landscape. I would invite you to talk to these folks after, and apologies, that's why I said 2, just to manage expectations. I would say at lunchtime, go find folks, right? So you can have a conversation. And very quickly, because Peter's going to say we're done, 30 seconds to sort of final thoughts to share with the folks. And they're probably quite hungry at the moment. So we'll start with you, Meta.
I'll keep it very short. We are setting up a marketplace as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, where we try also to facilitate those that need additional financing and those that have some that want to take it to the local community. So just want to say that. And I want to invite all of you to become members of Generation Restoration. Sign up, have a look at our website, be an active member on that. And thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you, Meta. Rebecca.
It's been really exciting to hear kind of the same themes over and over about inclusiveness, about connection. And I think if we can translate some of the commitments that have been made these past 10 days down into action on the ground and do a much better job than we have historically about building those links and those connections. But at least now there's a commitment at the top, which you mentioned hasn't existed before. So let's accelerate through those next phases, right? And find a way to make these types of projects happen.
Jen?
Just really quickly, I would say that so many of us, myself included, have looked to these last several weeks to say, oh, if we can just get through COP, there's light at the other side of that tunnel. I don't think that's true. I think we're all going to walk away from these events saying we've got more work to do than ever. Yeah. So, take maybe the weekend off, and then we'll all get back to
the real work begins now. Right. I want to thank the World Climate Foundation to actually have the foresight to actually convene around biodiversity, because the two dual existential crises before us as humanity, climate change and biodiversity loss, they go so hand in hand, and the conversations need to be about both. Thank you for staying and listening and not nodding off.
Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you. And as we've heard, I think